Frank Madden stood in a windowless Boston University laboratory in 1958, staring at a camera system that would have to do something no machine had ever done: photograph the Earth from space with enough clarity to count Soviet bombers on an airfield. He was 32 years old, held degrees in mechanical and optical engineering, and had just been recruited by a CIA front company called Itek Corporation. The job description was simple. The execution was impossible. The agency needed this camera operational within 2 years, not for scientific research, not for mapping, for survival. American intelligence had exactly 0 reliable photographs of Soviet military installations. The U-2 spy plane had provided some coverage, but vast stretches of Soviet territory remained invisible. Madden's assignment: design a camera that could scan entire regions of the USSR from an orbiting satellite, survive the violence of a rocket launch, function in the vacuum of space, and capture images sharp enough to identify individual aircraft from 100 miles above the Earth's surface. Madden had never designed anything for spaceflight. Neither had anyone else in 1958. NASA wouldn't launch its first American into space for another 3 years. The engineering challenges weren't just difficult, they defied known solutions. A satellite travels at roughly 17,000 miles per hour. Point a camera at the ground from that speed, and you get a useless blur. The blur isn't from shutter speed. It's from image motion, the camera racing forward while the lens captures the scene below. On an aircraft, engineers compensate by moving film backward during exposure to match ground speed. But satellites move 3 times faster than any airplane, and the compensation mechanism would need to function flawlessly in 0 gravity, in temperatures ranging from 250 degrees Celsius in sunlight to minus 150 degrees Celsius in shadow, in a vacuum that would instantly evaporate conventional lubricants. Then there was the film problem. Madden's camera would need to carry enough film to photograph millions of square miles. That meant roughly 3,000 feet of 70mm stock weighing 40 pounds. The film would have to feed through the camera, advance precisely between frames, wind onto take-up reels, and do all of this while the satellite tumbled through orbit exposed to cosmic radiation that could fog the emulsion before a single frame was shot. And Madden couldn't test any of it. Not really. You can't simulate the vacuum of space or the sustained G-forces of launch in 1958. You design it, build it, put it on a rocket, and hope. If it fails, you get 0 data about why. The camera simply doesn't come back. Itek's laboratory gave Madden a small team, maybe a dozen optical and mechanical engineers, and access to some of the best lens grinders in America. The CIA gave him a code name for the camera system: Corona. They gave him a cover story. His team was building cameras for a scientific satellite program called Discoverer, and they gave him a deadline that assumed everything would work the first time. Madden started sketching designs in a notebook: panoramic scanning, dual cameras for stereoscopic coverage, a rotating drum to stabilize image motion, film cassettes that could be ejected from orbit. None of these concepts had been proven in space. Most hadn't been proven anywhere. But he had 18 months to deliver a working prototype, and the President of the United States was waiting. Dwight Eisenhower learned about the shootdown on May 5, 1960 during breakfast. A Soviet surface-to-air missile had hit Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane over Sverdlovsk at 70,000 feet, an altitude American intelligence had promised was unreachable. Powers survived. Worse, the Soviets recovered his camera intact, along with developed film showing Soviet military bases. Nikita Khrushchev displayed the wreckage in Moscow's Gorky Park like a trophy. Every U-2 flight over Soviet territory stopped immediately. The loss wasn't just operational, it was strategic. Eisenhower had based his entire military policy on surveillance. He'd resisted calls to build hundreds of bombers and missiles because U-2 photographs showed the Soviets didn't have the massive arsenal they claimed. Without those photographs, he was flying blind. The Joint Chiefs wanted to assume the worst-case scenario, that Khrushchev had deployed hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles across Siberia. They wanted matching American production. That meant tens of billions in defense spending that Eisenhower believed was unnecessary, and that would bankrupt the country. But belief wasn't enough. He needed proof. The U-2 was finished as a tool over Soviet airspace. That left satellites. Eisenhower had authorized Corona in 1958 as a backup system, something that might work eventually. Now he needed it working immediately. He called Richard Bissell, the CIA director overseeing Corona, and made the timeline clear: operational capability before the 1960 presidential election. That gave Madden and his team 4 months. The pressure came from every direction. Khrushchev was scheduled to meet Eisenhower at a Paris summit 2 weeks after the shootdown. He used the occasion to humiliate the president, demanding an apology and canceling the talks. The Soviet premier returned to Moscow and announced that his military had operational ICBMs capable of hitting any American city, missiles that could be turned out like sausages in Soviet factories. American newspapers ran panicked editorials about a missile gap. Senators demanded investigations into why the United States had fallen behind. Eisenhower knew Khrushchev was likely bluffing. The U-2 photos suggested the Soviets had maybe a handful of operational ICBMs, but likely and suggested weren't good enough. He needed pictures. He needed to count the missiles. Corona was the only system that could do it. If Madden's cameras worked, the engineering was mostly theoretical. In August 1960, Itek had delivered the camera prototypes. The Air Force had integrated them into satellite buses built by Lockheed. The capsule recovery system, designed by General Electric, existed on paper and in a few test articles. Nobody had ever recovered anything from orbit. The heat shield might work. The parachute might deploy. The Air Force cargo planes might catch the descending capsule with aerial nets. Might. Eisenhower authorized the first Corona launch attempt in February 1959, while the U-2 was still flying. That satellite failed to reach orbit. The Agena rocket exploded during ascent. The second attempt got to space, but the camera failed to operate. The third reached orbit, photographed Soviet territory, and ejected its film capsule. The capsule burned up during re-entry. The fourth attempt never made it off the pad. By May 1960, Corona had failed 12 consecutive times. After powers went down, Eisenhower couldn't afford to wait for the engineering to mature. He needed Madden's cameras to work now. The launches continued through the summer, each one carrying a satellite that cost $3 million and had maybe a 10% chance of success. Madden's breakthrough came from studying how the human eye sees depth. Two eyes, separated by a few inches, capture slightly different perspectives of the same scene. The brain merges those perspectives into three-dimensional understanding. Madden realized a satellite could do the same thing, not by having two eyes, but by having one camera photograph the same location twice, from different angles, as the satellite moved along its orbital path. The Corona satellite would carry two panoramic cameras mounted back to back. As the satellite traveled forward at 23,000 miles per hour, the forward-looking camera would photograph a strip of terrain at a 15-degree angle. 70 seconds later, after the satellite had moved roughly 275 miles downrange, the aft-looking camera would photograph that same strip from the opposite 15-degree angle, thread both strips of film through a stereoscopic viewer, and Soviet buildings would appear to rise from the landscape in 3 dimensions. More importantly, analysts could calculate precise heights, the altitude of a radar tower, the depth of a missile silo, the dimensions of an aircraft hangar. But stereoscopic coverage was secondary to the primary challenge: getting any usable image at all from a satellite moving faster than any aircraft ever built. Madden's solution was a rotating drum panoramic system. Instead of a fixed lens pointing straight down, Corona's camera used a lens that scanned side to side across a 120-degree arc, 70 degrees to the left, 70 degrees to the right, while the film moved behind it. The rotation compensated for the satellite's forward motion. When the lens pointed directly ahead in its scan, It captured terrain the satellite was approaching. When it rotated to point behind, it photographed terrain the satellite had just passed. The complete scan took place in 0.4 seconds. The lens itself was a marvel. A Tessar design with a 24-inch focal length, ground and polished to tolerances, measured in millionths of an inch. At the bottom of the scan, when the lens pointed straight down at the Earth 100 miles below, it could theoretically resolve objects as small as 5 feet across. That meant individual vehicles, individual aircraft, individual railroad cars. It meant the difference between knowing a Soviet airfield existed and knowing exactly how many bombers sat on its tarmac. Madden's team built the camera housing from machined aluminum, designed to maintain optical alignment through the crushing acceleration of launch and the thermal extremes of orbit. The film magazines held 3,000 feet of Eastman Kodak aerial reconnaissance stock, the sharpest film chemistry available. Loaded in total darkness and sealed to prevent any light leaks that would ruin the exposure. The entire assembly weighed 290 pounds. The film advancement mechanism might have been the most critical component. Between each panoramic scan, a stepper motor had to advance exactly 2.75 inches of film, stop precisely, hold steady during the next exposure, then advance again. Any slippage, any vibration, any misalignment would blur the image. Madden used a vacuum platen, a flat surface with tiny holes that sucked the film against a reference plane during exposure to keep each frame perfectly flat. The vacuum system had to work in space, where there was already a vacuum outside the camera. The engineering was circular, almost absurd. Testing happened in sections. Itek could spin the camera in a laboratory, could run film through it, could photograph test targets, but they couldn't simulate 100 miles of atmosphere, couldn't reproduce the exact vibration signature of an Agena rocket, couldn't predict how film emulsion would react to weeks of cosmic radiation. Madden shipped the first flight cameras in early 1959, knowing they were probably going to fail. Getting photographs from orbit solved only half the problem. The other half was insane. Eject a 40-pound capsule from a satellite traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, have it survive re-entry temperatures that would melt steel, parachute it gently through 60 miles of atmosphere, and catch it in midair with an airplane before it hit the ocean. General Electric designed the recovery system. The film capsule, shaped like a squat cone, 40 inches long and 27 inches in diameter, sat at the front of the satellite. When Corona finished its photographic mission, typically after 7 days in orbit, explosive bolts would fire, separating the capsule from the satellite bus. Small retro rockets would slow the capsule just enough to drop it out of orbit. Then gravity would take over. The capsule would hit the upper atmosphere at nearly 25,000 feet per second. Friction with air molecules would generate temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize aluminum, hot enough to turn the capsule's heat shield into a glowing plasma trail visible for hundreds of miles. The heat shield was ablative material, designed to burn away gradually, carrying heat away from the film inside. If the shield burned too slowly, the capsule would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water and tumble back into space. If it burned too quickly, the film would cook. At 60,000 feet, a barometric switch would trigger a small parachute, the drogue chute, designed to stabilize the capsule and slow its descent. At 14,000 feet, the main parachute would deploy, an orange and white canopy, 300 feet in circumference. The capsule would drift down at roughly 35 feet per second, taking about 7 minutes to descend from 14,000 feet to sea level. That's where the CR-19 flying boxcar came in. The Air Force modified 6 of these cargo aircraft for aerial recovery, installing a winch system and a trapeze-like boom that extended from the rear cargo door. As the capsule descended under its parachute, a C-119 would fly directly at it, attempting to snag the parachute shroud lines with the trapeze. Pilots called it catching a falling star. The margin for error was practically zero. The C-119 cruised at about 200 miles per hour. The parachute drifted with wind currents that could shift unpredictably. The pilot had maybe 3 passes before the capsule hit the water. If the aircraft missed, Navy helicopters would attempt to retrieve the capsule from the ocean before it sank. The capsule would float for maybe 24 hours, thanks to flotation bags, but salt water could seep into the seals and ruin the film. Ocean recovery was a backup plan, not a solution. The entire concept violated common sense. Madden's cameras would photograph Soviet territory for a week, accumulating images worth billions in intelligence value, and then the CIA would gamble everything on explosive bolts, heat shields, parachutes, and a cargo plane pilot threading a needle at 10,000 feet. One failure anywhere in the chain, retro rockets misfire, heat shield cracks, parachute tangles, pilot misjudges the approach, and the mission was worthless. General Electric tested the recovery system the only way they could: drop dummy capsules from high-altitude balloons and practice catching them. The tests went reasonably well, but a balloon drop from 100,000 feet wasn't the same as a capsule screaming through re-entry from orbit. Nobody knew if the heat shield would hold. Nobody knew if the parachute would survive deployment at supersonic speeds. Nobody knew if the flotation system would actually keep the capsule from sinking if it hit the ocean. Madden's cameras were brilliant. The recovery system was a prayer wrapped in engineering. Discoverer 1 launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base on February 28, 1959. The Agena rocket performed flawlessly, inserting the satellite into polar orbit. Then the satellite's attitude control system failed. The cameras never activated. Mission failure. Discoverer 2 launched April 13th. The satellite reached orbit. The cameras operated. The film capsule ejected on command. But the retro rockets misfired, sending the capsule into the Arctic instead of the recovery zone near Hawaii. Navy ships searched for 3 days. They found nothing. Mission failure. Discoverer 3 never reached orbit. The Agena upper stage exploded. Discoverer 4 made orbit, but the cameras malfunctioned. Discoverer 5 reached orbit, photographed Soviet territory, ejected its capsule, but the parachute failed to deploy. The capsule hit the Pacific at terminal velocity and disintegrated. Discoverer 6's retro rockets failed. Discoverer 7's capsule separated from the satellite, but vanished. No radio beacon, no parachute sighting, nothing. Madden worked from Itek's laboratory outside Boston, receiving failure reports by secure telephone. Each report was clinical: component failure, telemetry loss, recovery, unsuccessful. Behind each report was 6 months of work, designing modifications, testing assemblies, shipping hardware to California, watching the launch from a classified control room, and then the call. The call was always the same: something broke. By August 1960, Corona had attempted 13 launches, 13 failures. The engineering problems were maddeningly varied. One mission failed because a battery overheated. Another failed when the film take-up reel jammed. Another failed when the satellite's nitrogen gas bottles, used for attitude control, leaked their supply into space within hours of reaching orbit, leaving the satellite tumbling uselessly. There was no pattern, no single flaw to fix. Each failure revealed a new way for space to destroy a satellite. Congress was losing patience. The program had cost $120 million, extraordinary money in 1960, and delivered zero usable intelligence. Senator Richard Russell, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, told CIA Director Allen Dulles that Corona looked like an expensive fantasy. The Air Force had its own reconnaissance satellite program in development called SAMOS, which promised better cameras and more reliable recovery. Some CIA officials quietly suggested abandoning Corona entirely. Madden kept redesigning. The camera stabilization system was too sensitive to vibration. He added dampeners. The film advance motor couldn't handle temperature extremes. He specified new lubricants rated for space. The lens housing shifted slightly during launch. He reinforced the mounting brackets. Each fix took weeks to implement and couldn't be tested until the next launch. And each launch cost $3 million, and had maybe 6 weeks of preparation time. Discoverer 13 launched August 10, 1960. The satellite reached orbit. The cameras operated. On August 11th, after completing 17 orbits, the film capsule ejected. The retro rockets fired correctly. The capsule descended toward the recovery zone. The drogue chute deployed. The main parachute deployed. C-119 aircraft were waiting, but the pilots couldn't locate the capsule. The radio beacon was transmitting on the wrong frequency. A Navy helicopter spotted the capsule floating in the ocean and retrieved it before it sank. When they opened the capsule, the film magazines were empty. Madden had forgotten to load film before shipping the cameras to Vandenberg. It was the kind of mistake that happens when you're working 18-hour days, managing a dozen subcontractors, and haven't had a success in 17 months. The recovery system worked perfectly. The cameras operated flawlessly, but there was nothing to recover. Discoverer 14 was scheduled for launch in 1 week. Discoverer 14 lifted off from Vandenberg on August 18, 1960, at 1:28 p.m. Pacific Time. The Thor booster burned cleanly through first stage. The Agena upper stage ignited on schedule, pushing the satellite into a polar orbit inclined at 80 degrees, a trajectory that would carry Corona's cameras over the Soviet Union on every second pass. Madden monitored the telemetry from CIA headquarters in Washington. Altitude stabilized at 115 miles. Cameras powered on. Film began moving through the first panoramic scan. For the next 27 hours, while Discoverer 14 completed 17 orbits, Madden's cameras photographed 1.6 million square miles of Soviet territory. The satellite passed over missile test ranges in Kazakhstan, submarine bases on the Kola Peninsula, airfields in Ukraine, ICBM complexes in Siberia. The forward and aft cameras scanned continuously, capturing overlapping stereoscopic coverage. The film advanced precisely between frames. The vacuum platen held each exposure flat. Nothing broke. On August 19th, after the 17th orbit, ground controllers transmitted the recovery sequence. The explosive bolts fired. The film capsule separated. Retro rockets burned for exactly 3.6 seconds, slowing the capsule enough to drop from orbit. Re-entry began over the Aleutian Islands. The heat shield glowed white-hot as the capsule plunged through the upper atmosphere at Mach 20. Plasma trails streamed behind it, visible from the ground as a second sunrise. At 60,000 feet, the barometric trigger released the drogue chute. At 14,000 feet, the main parachute deployed, 300 feet of orange and white nylon blossoming against the morning sky. The capsule drifted west, pushed by Pacific winds, descending at 35 feet per second toward the recovery zone 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Captain Harold Mitchell was flying the lead C-119. He'd practiced aerial recovery for 6 months, catching dummy capsules dropped from balloons, but he'd never attempted a satellite recovery. The previous 13 Corona missions had given him no opportunities. He spotted the parachute at 8,000 feet, a bright orange dot against blue sky. He pushed the C-119 into a shallow dive, accelerating to 210 miles per hour, lining up the approach so the trapeze boom extended from his cargo door would intersect the parachute shroud lines. The timing was impossible to calculate precisely. The capsule was drifting. The C-119 was bouncing in turbulence. Mitchell watched the parachute grow larger through his windscreen, made a slight correction left, held steady. The boom passed beneath the parachute. The shroud lines draped across the trapeze. The winch operator triggered the snare mechanism. The lines caught. The winch engaged, pulling the parachute and capsule into the cargo bay. Mitchell climbed to 10,000 feet and turned toward Hickam Air Force Base. The entire aerial recovery, from visual acquisition to capsule secured, had taken 7 minutes. It was 10:46 a.m. Hawaii time. Mitchell radioed Hickam Tower with a coded message. "We have a baby." It meant Corona had finally worked. At Hickam, technicians transferred the capsule to a refrigerated truck and drove it directly to a processing facility. They opened the capsule in darkness, removed the film magazines, and began developing the first strips. The images appeared in the chemical baths, Soviet airfields photographed from directly overhead, buildings casting crisp shadows, individual aircraft visible on tarmacs. After 16 failures and 18 months of engineering hell, Madden's cameras had delivered 3,000 feet of usable film. A courier flew the developed film to Washington that night. Photo interpreters at CIA headquarters began analysis immediately. What they found in those images would dismantle one of the great strategic myths of the Cold War. The Discoverer 14 film reached CIA headquarters on August 20th. Photo interpreters unrolled the first sections on light tables and began the tedious work of identifying landmarks, measuring structures, and cataloging military installations. Within hours, they realized they were looking at more Soviet territory than every U-2 mission combined had photographed. The U-2 had flown 24 successful overflights of the USSR before powers went down. Those flights had captured maybe 2 million square miles total, stitched together from dangerous sorties that risked pilots and provoked international incidents. Discoverer 14's single mission had photographed 1.6 million square miles in 27 hours, and the satellite had been untouchable the entire time. But the raw coverage mattered less than what the images revealed. Eisenhower had authorized Corona to answer one specific question. How many intercontinental ballistic missiles did the Soviets have? Khrushchev had been claiming since 1957 that Soviet factories were mass-producing ICBMs, that his military possessed hundreds of operational missiles capable of striking American cities. His public statements were deliberate and terrifying. During a 1959 speech, he declared that missiles were being turned out like sausages, and that Soviet production capacity far exceeded anything the United States could match. American intelligence had reasons to doubt these claims. The few U-2 photographs of Soviet missile facilities showed limited infrastructure. But doubt wasn't certainty. Without comprehensive coverage, the CIA couldn't rule out the possibility that the Soviets had simply hidden their ICBMs in areas the U-2 hadn't reached. The Pentagon's worst-case estimates put Soviet ICBM strength at 500 operational missiles by 1961. Some analysts believed the number could be higher. Madden's cameras told a different story. The interpreters identified every suspected ICBM site in the Soviet Union, cross-referencing locations with signals intelligence and earlier U-2 coverage. They found the Tyuratam launch complex in Kazakhstan, where the Soviets tested their R-7 missile, the world's first operational ICBM. They found missile assembly buildings, propellant storage facilities, rail lines capable of transporting missiles. They counted launch pads. The total number of operational Soviet ICBMs in August 1960 was 4, not 400. Not 500? 4. The R-7 was a massive missile, 100 feet tall, requiring a fixed launch pad the size of a city block. You couldn't hide an R-7 installation. The infrastructure was too large, and Corona's cameras were sharp enough to see all of it. The missile gap was fiction. Khrushchev had been bluffing. The Soviet Union was still building its first-generation ICBM force, struggling with the same engineering problems that had plagued American missile development. They had nuclear weapons, and they had bombers. But the overwhelming missile superiority they'd claimed simply didn't exist. Eisenhower received the analysis in late August. He'd suspected the truth for months, but hadn't been able to prove it. Now he had photographs. The Pentagon's worst-case projections were wrong by a factor of 100. The defense hawks pushing for crash production of American ICBMs were operating on bad assumptions. The United States didn't need to bankrupt itself matching a Soviet arsenal that didn't exist. The political implications were enormous. Presidential candidate John Kennedy had been campaigning on the missile gap, promising to close it with massive defense spending. Eisenhower couldn't publicly refute Kennedy's claims without revealing Corona, and Corona was too valuable to expose. The Soviets didn't know their territory had been photographed. They didn't know their bluff had been called. So Eisenhower kept the information classified. Kennedy won the 1960 election, partly by attacking the missile gap. Only after taking office Was Kennedy shown the Corona photographs? The gap he'd campaigned against didn't exist. Frank Madden watched the moon landing on television in July 1969 from his home outside Boston. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and declared it one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. President Nixon called the astronauts from the White House. Newspapers ran front-page photographs of Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The whole world knew their names, knew their faces, knew they'd been to the moon and returned. Madden had sent 145 satellites into orbit by then. His cameras had photographed every Soviet military installation, every Chinese nuclear facility, every Warsaw Pact airfield. Corona satellites had mapped the entire communist bloc with resolution sharp enough to identify individual vehicles. The program had revolutionized intelligence collection, eliminated strategic uncertainty, and made possible every arms control treaty the superpowers would negotiate. And Madden couldn't tell anyone. The CIA had classified his name in 1958. His employment records at Itek listed him as working on advanced optical systems, a description vague enough to mean anything. He couldn't tell his children what he did for work. He couldn't tell his neighbors. When friends asked about his job, he'd mumble something about cameras and change the subject. His wife knew he worked on satellites, but even she didn't know the details. Corona remained classified through the 1960s, through the 1970s, through the 1980s. The program officially ended in 1972 after launching 145 missions and returning 800,000 images. By then, the satellites had been superseded by more advanced reconnaissance systems with better cameras and real-time transmission capabilities. But Corona's existence stayed secret. The Soviets knew American satellites were photographing their territory. They could track the orbital passes, but the CIA refused to confirm it publicly. Acknowledging Corona would reveal technical capabilities, operational procedures, and exactly how much the United States could see from space. Madden retired from Itek in 1984. He'd spent 26 years designing reconnaissance cameras, had watched his systems evolve from the crude panoramic scanners of Corona to sophisticated digital imagers. He'd helped win the Cold War, and his contribution was classified. He wasn't entirely alone. The engineers who'd worked on Corona knew what they'd built. They'd gather occasionally at Itek for unofficial reunions, trading stories about the early failures and celebrating the successes that nobody outside the program would ever hear about. But there were no public ceremonies, no presidential commendations, no acknowledgement that any of them had done anything worth remembering. The Apollo astronauts got ticker tape parades. Madden got a security clearance that forbade him from discussing the most important work of his life. The contrast was cruel. Armstrong and Aldrin had spent 8 days in space and become immortal. Madden's satellites had spent years in space, and their designer remained anonymous. The classification wasn't about protecting Madden. It was about protecting capabilities. Every detail the CIA revealed about Corona, camera resolution, film capacity, orbital parameters, would teach adversaries what American satellites could and couldn't see. That information would help them design better camouflage, better concealment, better countermeasures. So the CIA kept everything secret. The satellite designs, the launch records, the images, and the names of the engineers who'd made it possible. By the 1990s, Corona's technology was 30 years obsolete. The satellites that replaced it could photograph objects 10 times smaller, could transmit images electronically, could see through clouds with radar. But the CIA still refused to declassify the program. Madden was 68 years old. He'd kept the secret for 37 years, and he'd keep it until the government decided he didn't have to anymore. President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 951 on February 22, 1995. The order declassified Corona and its sister programs, releasing more than 800,000 satellite photographs to the National Archives. Historians, geographers, and archaeologists could finally access images that had been locked in CIA vaults for 3 decades. The photographs showed the world as it existed during the Cold War, Soviet cities before they expanded, Middle Eastern landscapes before development, environmental changes across entire continents. For Madden, then 69 years old, the declassification meant something simpler. He could finally talk about what he'd built. The CIA organized a public ceremony acknowledging the engineers and program managers who'd created America's first space reconnaissance capability. Madden's name appeared in official histories. Journalists called for interviews. His children learned, for the first time in detail, what their father had done in those windowless laboratories. The public recognition came with perspective. Madden could see how Corona had shaped history in ways even he hadn't fully understood while building it. The satellite photographs hadn't just counted Soviet missiles. They'd documented the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, confirming the presence of nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from Florida. They'd tracked Chinese nuclear weapons development, photographing the Lopner test site before and after detonations. They'd monitored the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The images revealed more than military installations. Scientists used corona photographs to study deforestation in the Amazon, urban sprawl in developing nations, and archaeological sites that had been destroyed by development. The stereoscopic capability Madden had designed, 2 cameras photographing from different angles, let researchers create 3-dimensional terrain maps of regions that had never been surveyed. The photographs became a baseline for measuring environmental change, showing what the Earth looked like before satellites became routine. Madden gave lectures at universities, walked audiences through the engineering challenges of building a camera for space in 1958, described the failures and the desperate push to make Discoverer 14 work. Students asked how it felt to work in secret for so long. He told them the classification had been frustrating, but necessary. The secrecy had protected the program while it was operational. Declassification in 1995 made sense because the technology was obsolete and the Cold War was over. What surprised him most was how many people had used corona data without knowing the source. Arms control negotiators in the 1970s had relied on satellite verification to make treaties possible. Both superpowers knew compliance could be monitored from space, which made cheating pointless. The SALT-I Treaty, the ABM Treaty, START negotiations, all depended on reconnaissance satellites that traced their lineage directly to Madden's cameras. The negotiators knew satellites were watching. They didn't know who'd built the first one. By 2010, researchers had cataloged nearly 900,000 corona images in the U.S. Geological Survey Archive. The photographs covered 750 million square miles of Earth's surface. Some regions photographed dozens of times between 1960 and 1972. The collection represented the largest single declassified intelligence dataset in American history. Madden died in 2012 at age 86. His obituary in the Boston Globe identified him as the lead optical engineer for Corona, the spy satellite program that had photographed the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. The obituary mentioned his degrees from Boston University, his 26 years at Itek, and the presidential recognition he'd received in 1995. It didn't mention the 17 failures before success, the 18-hour workdays, or the 37 years he'd spent keeping his life's work secret. Some details never make it into the official record.